They thought they owned the ground beneath my feet. I drilled a legal well on my land with my money to protect my kids during the worst drought this town had ever seen. But the moment water started flowing, the HOA came knocking. Not to congratulate me, but to claim my well as their own. They called it a shared community resource. They threatened legal action. They broke into my system. They stole from me drop by drop until I had no choice but to fight back. But what they didn't know was that I know the law, and I don't back down. What started as one well turned into a courtroom war. Secrets leaked, emails exposed, power shifted, and when the truth came out, the entire neighborhood turned against them. This isn't just about water. It's about control abuse of power. And one man who stood up and said, "Not on my land." I never imagined that something as basic as water could ignite a war right in my own backyard. Yet here I was, caught in a storm I hadn't seen coming, in a neighborhood that had morphed into a petty kingdom ruled by a handful of self-appointed overseers who wielded clipboards like scepters. When I first moved to Hollow Creek Estates, I was a widowed father of two, Emma and Alex, freshly retired from 25 years with the Army Corps of Engineers. All I wanted was a calm corner of the world to raise my children, a place where the days stretched out peacefully and the nights weren't haunted by memories of far-off deserts and endless projects. What I found instead was anything but tranquil. That summer, the drought descended like a slow-moving siege. Reservoirs shrank to cracked mud basins. Lawns turned the color of straw. The county slapped strict watering restrictions on us, and the Hollow Creek Homeowners Association responded not with understanding or shared sacrifice, but with iron-fisted edicts that squeezed the life out of daily living. They mailed out fines for any hint of brown grass, while quietly approving tanker trucks to dump thousands of gallons on the manicured flower beds, framing the neighborhood entrance paid for, of course, with our communal dues. The hypocrisy stung like dry wind against bare skin. I watched my neighbors struggle under the weight of it all. Sprinklers hissed furtively after midnight to evade patrols. Children were shooed indoors, barred from playing on their own scorched yards. Vegetable gardens withered into dusty skeletons. It gnawed at me. I knew land. I knew water. After decades directing massive infrastructure builds across parched regions of the Southwest, I understood aquifers' drilling depths and, most importantly, what property rights truly meant beneath the surface. One quiet evening, with Emma and Alex asleep upstairs, I spread the deed county zoning maps and the association covenants across the kitchen table. I read every line under the warm glow of the pendant light, tracing clauses with my finger until the words blurred. The conclusion was unmistakable. I held full legal authority to sink a private well on my own lot. No permission required from the board. No obligation to notify them. The groundwater beneath my property was mine to access, just as the sunlight falling on my roof or the rain that soaked my soil belonged to me. This wasn't about defiance or stirring trouble. It was about survival and simple human decency. I'd seen good people worn down by arbitrary rules and bureaucratic indifference. My daughter Emma deserved to chase fireflies across green grass again. My son Alex needed a place to splash in a kiddie pool without the shadow of guilt hanging over summer fun. I wanted my children to grow up remembering laughter in the backyard, not the brittle crunch of dead turf underfoot. So I did what I've always done when the world turns unreasonable. I took deliberate, measured action. I called an old contact, Clearwater Solutions, a reputable drilling firm I'd collaborated with on a federal reservoir project years earlier. Their lead hydrologist visited the next week, boots crunching over my brittle lawn as he studied soil samples and geophysical scans. The prognosis was promising. A reliable pocket of fresh water sat roughly 180 feet down, tucked safely in a shallow aquifer that posed no risk to neighboring properties. I submitted the permit application to the county. No objections surfaced. I notified the Municipal Water Authority, smooth sailing there as well. Deliberately, I kept the association in the dark. Their bylaws granted them no dominion over subsurface rights on private land, and I wasn't about to give them an early chance to manufacture obstacles. The drilling rig arrived on a blistering Tuesday morning in July, its diesel engine rumbling like distant thunder. By midday, curious neighbors had gathered along the cul-de-sac in small clusters, shading their eyes against the glare. I kept my responses short and steady, just some routine infrastructure work. But as the bit chewed deeper into the earth, I sensed the atmosphere shift. Whispers floated on the hot air. Sideways glances sharpened, and then she appeared. Deborah Keller, president of the association, strode across the street in crisp linen pants and oversized sunglasses, her expression carved from disapproval. Power radiated from her not through wisdom or warmth, but through an unyielding command of the rulebook she treated as sacred text. She didn't approach to inquire. She arrived to reassert dominion. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded, arms folded, staring at the rig, as if it were an invading force. "A permitted private well on my own land," I answered, evenly meeting her gaze. "All paperwork filed, all regulations satisfied." "You didn't inform the board," she replied, voice laced with accusation. "No requirement exists for me to do so," I said, handing her a printed excerpt from the very covenants she cherished. Her lips tightened. She wasn't accustomed to pushback. Without another word, she pivoted sharply and marched away. But the chill in her departing glance lingered like a warning cloud on the horizon. This, I knew in my gut, was only the beginning. By the end of that sweltering week, the well was finished. A compact, high-efficiency pump nestled quietly beneath a low stone casing I'd built myself near the garage. Nothing flashy, no towering pipes or clanking machinery to offend the neighborhood's precious aesthetics. Just a discreet portal to the cool, clear water that had always been there waiting beneath our feet. I had the output filtered, lab-tested, and seamlessly tied into my irrigation lines. Within days, the garden revived in a riot of green tomatoes swelling on the vine roses, unfurling like secrets, and the lawn reclaiming its soft, springy texture. For the first time in months, the backyard echoed with the sounds I'd missed most. Emma squealed as she darted through the sprinkler's cool mist droplets sparkling like diamonds in her hair. Alex cannonballed into his inflated pool with gleeful shouts sending arcs of water over the fence. Laughter, pure unburdened childhood laughter, floated on the warm evening air, mingling with the scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming jasmine. It felt like breathing again after holding my breath for too long. But peace, I was about to learn, can be the most provocative thing of all in a place governed by envy and control. The following Monday, a crisp white envelope slid through the mail slot, bearing the embossed letterhead of the Hollow Creek Homeowners Association. I opened it in the kitchen while the coffee brewed the rich aroma, doing little to soften the words that stared back at me. The letter declared in formal legalese that the well located at 742 Crestmont Lane was now deemed a communal resource, and that its yield would be subject to equitable distribution pursuant to the shared use provisions of the Hollow Creek Estates covenants. I actually laughed, sharp incredulous, standing there in my quiet kitchen. The audacity was breathtaking. They weren't merely upset that I'd sidestepped their restrictions. They wanted to seize the very solution I'd paid for with my own savings, drilled beneath my own soil and maintained with my own hands. It wasn't oversight. It was outright appropriation. In that moment, something hardened inside me. This wasn't going to end with polite letters or neighborly compromise. This was heading straight to court. If I'd known how much upheaval a few hundred gallons of pristine water would unleash, I might have drilled that well even sooner, just to watch their carefully curated facade begin to fracture. Word travels fast in a cul-de-sac. Within days, my resurrected lawn became the unspoken center of neighborhood conversation. Where every other yard remained brittle and brown, mine glowed emerald under the relentless sun, a silent accusation against the board's failed stewardship. Some neighbors offered cautious nods of approval when we passed on evening walks. Others averted their eyes, as though my small act of independence somehow threatened the fragile order they'd accepted. I returned to my documents with renewed focus, spreading them across the dining table after the kids were in bed. The shared use clause they'd cited applied exclusively to common areas, the clubhouse entrance landscaping retention ponds. It had zero jurisdiction over private subsurface resources. Yet facts rarely deterred people whose livelihood was control. 3 evenings later, as fireflies began their lazy dance, Over the grass, headlights swept across my front window. Deborah Keller returned this time, flanked by two board members clutching a clipboard thick enough to serve as body armor. They halted at the edge of my driveway, careful not to cross the property line, as if mere proximity granted them authority. "We've thoroughly reviewed the matter," she began, her tone polished with false civility. "While your installation sits on private soil, the aquifer itself constitutes a shared natural resource." I folded my arms, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle her. "So, you'll be claiming rights to the sunlight on my solar panels next?" I asked quietly. Her mouth twitched, but no smile came. "The board has voted unanimously," she pressed on. "We request voluntary access for association landscaping needs. The entry beds, the park strips, the cul-de-sac islands. A simple tap line, minimal impact." "You voted to confiscate what isn't yours," I replied, voice steady. "We voted to preserve community harmony." She snapped the mask, slipping for the first time. "I drilled this well so my children could have a normal summer one that doesn't reek of drought and over-chlorinated desperation." Tom Harding, a board member I'd barely spoken to in years, attempted a conciliatory tone. "John, it's nothing personal, just a small connection, for the greater good." But it was deeply personal. From the instant I'd chosen self-reliance over submission, I'd become a crack in their carefully mortared authority. "I think it's time for you to leave," I said, the calm forged from years of commanding men in far more dangerous circumstances. "You're on my property now." Conversation over. They retreated without protest, but the tension lingered like the humid air before a storm. I knew they weren't conceding. They were simply regrouping. That same week, odd incidents began. A white pickup truck idled across the street for nearly an hour, engine rumbling low. The next day, a man in a reflective safety vest strolled along my side yard, peering at utility markers. When I stepped outside, he muttered something about routine mapping and hurried away. My security cameras caught the same truck circling the block 3 times the previous night. Paranoia wasn't my habit, but vigilance was. I reviewed my permits again, inspected the wellhead, and ran fresh pressure tests. Everything remained pristine and legal. Still, an uneasy current ran beneath the surface calm. Behind closed doors and whispered phone calls, something darker was taking shape. And soon, it would emerge like a hidden pipe snaking beneath the grass, siphoning away more than just water. That weekend, the association called a special session, announced only to a select few, held behind closed doors in the clubhouse after hours. The rest of us learned about it through fragments of gossip and cryptic emails that landed in our inboxes too late to attend. What leaked out from that shadowy gathering was a proposal so brazen it bordered on farce. The board had drafted an amendment to the covenants. Any privately installed utility that drew from shared environmental resources, sunlight, air, groundwater, would henceforth require regulated community access, complete with usage fees and mandatory reporting. It was dressed up in lofty language about equity and sustainability, but everyone knew the target. My well, my water, my independence. They actually believed they could legislate ownership away with a vote and a smug majority. I didn't plan to storm the next open meeting. I went to observe, to document. I brought a small digital recorder in my shirt pocket, a legal notepad, and Nathan, my old army buddy turned city zoning officer, who slipped in wearing jeans and a baseball cap, silent as a shadow. He owed me, from a long-ago favor in a sandstorm halfway across the world. Tonight, he was just another face in the crowd. Deborah Keller presided from the front table like a monarch addressing her court. She spoke of resource equity and preserving the aesthetic integrity of Hollow Creek, painting my well as a reckless, selfish gamble that could destabilize soil moisture levels and invite contamination risks if left unregulated. The fear-mongering was masterful. Heads nodded. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, until I stood. "I'd like the floor," I said calmly. Her eyes flicked to the agenda in her hand. "You're not on the list, Mr. Monroe." "This isn't a closed regime," I replied. "You're asking residents to vote on rewriting private property rights. The affected homeowner deserves a voice." She couldn't refuse without exposing the hypocrisy. So she nodded stiffly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I spoke of the months we'd endured, skyrocketing water bills, cracked mains the board had ignored for years, pleas for sensible conservation that went unanswered. I described Emma and Alex playing in a yard that finally felt like home again. I projected photos on my phone for anyone close enough to see crystal clear lab results, stamped permits receipts for every dollar spent. Then I showed the footage, grainy but unmistakable, of the man in the safety vest trespassing along my fence line 2 nights earlier. A hush fell heavier than the summer heat. Finally, I held up a letter from the county water authority official, confirmation that my well was fully compliant and that any unauthorized connection to it would constitute theft of utility service under state law, punishable by fines and potential criminal charges. The room shifted. I watched doubt flicker across faces that had been nodding along minutes before. Tom Harding leaned back in his chair, as if the air had been sucked out of it. Deborah's cheeks flushed beneath her carefully applied foundation. I closed with a single quiet warning. If this amendment passes, you're not just voting to take my water. You're voting to drag this entire association and every dues-paying member into a lawsuit I've already outlined with counsel. One I will pursue to the end. I sat down. No applause, no outburst. Just a thick, uncomfortable silence that spoke louder than any cheer. Deborah recovered quickly, calling for a delay on the vote to allow further review. But the damage was done. The spell of unquestioned authority had cracked, and everyone in that room felt the fracture. I drove home under a sky bruised with storm clouds, the first fat raindrops in months splattering the windshield. Emma and Alex were already asleep, their rooms glowing faintly from nightlights. I stood in the doorway of each for a long moment, listening to their steady breathing, feeling the weight of what I was protecting. The vote had been postponed, the law remained on my side. But I knew people like Keller didn't accept setbacks. They schemed in the dark. And 2 mornings later, the ground itself betrayed their next move. I was sipping coffee on the porch, watching dawn paint the rooftops gold, when something caught my eye, a narrow strip of earth near the back fence that looked freshly disturbed. The grass had been carefully replaced, but the edges didn't quite match. A straight, unnatural line ran from my property toward the association-maintained greenbelt beyond the utility easement. My pulse quickened. I followed it on foot, careful not to disturb the surface. The trail ended at a nondescript junction box nestled in city-managed mulch. Nothing screamed tampering at first glance. But I'd spent decades reading the language of soil and infrastructure. This wasn't animal activity. This was deliberate, precise, hidden. I didn't dig, not yet. I marked the spot and my mind went inside and called Nathan. He arrived within the hour in an unmarked city truck, accompanied by 2 utility inspectors, armed with ground-penetrating gear and a fiber optic scope. By late afternoon, beneath a sky now heavy with real rain, we had irrefutable proof. Someone had spliced into my water line 4 feet underground, a crude PVC bypass that snaked out of my yard beneath the greenbelt and fed directly into the association's sprinkler control manifold. No permits, no backflow prevention, no paperwork, just theft, plain and ugly. Nathan shook his head in disbelief. This isn't overreach, John. This is felony utility theft. We documented everything. Photographs from every angle, depth, measurements, flow readings that showed active draw even as we stood there. Evidence now existed, cold hard and prosecutable. That night, with thunder rumbling overhead and rain finally drumming on the roof, I called Stephanie Linwood. She listened without interruption as I laid out the timeline, the threats, the illegal tap. When I finished, her voice was steel wrapped in silk. "You've got a slam-dunk case," she said. "Trespass, theft, property, interference, abuse of authority. They're cornered, and cornered animals make mistakes. We're going to make them regret every single one." By the end of the week, a cease and desist letter bearing her firm's letterhead landed on the association's doorstep, followed swiftly by an emergency injunction filing. The retaliation began almost immediately. But so did the unraveling of their control, their lies, and the fragile empire Deborah Keller had built on fear and fine print. And for the first time since this began, I felt the tide turning. The retaliation arrived in waves, each one more desperate than the last. First came the violation notices, 2 thick envelopes in the mailbox by the end of that same week. One cited my well structure for failing imaginary aesthetic standards that didn't exist in any covenant. The other accused me of unauthorized modifications to landscaping because of the neat ring of protective bark mulch I'd spread around the stone casing to prevent erosion. Daily fines, $100. Lien threats. Mandatory arbitration clauses quoted in bold. I didn't flinch, I didn't pay a cent. Instead, I fought fire with sunlight. I designed a simple one-page flyer on my laptop late one night while Emma and Alex slept. Black bullet points on clean white stock titled in bold capitals. The truth about my well and how the board is stealing from us all. It laid out the timeline plainly: the drought, the ignored infrastructure, please the illegal, siphon the court filings. I included redacted photos of the buried pipe the county permits and the water authority's theft warning. No accusations screamed in all caps, just facts, cold and undeniable. The next morning, coffee in one hand and a stack of flyers in the other, I walked every sidewalk in Hollow Creek Estates, door to door, face to face. Most neighbors accepted the paper politely. Some read it on the spot, eyes widening. A few asked quiet questions. And then there was Rosa Martinez. Rosa lived 4 houses down a sharp-eyed widow in her 60s whose late husband had been a county judge. She took the flyer, scanned it once, and shook her head slowly. I knew they were up to something, she said, voice low but steady. 2 weeks ago, my irrigation timer quit, but the pressure on my whole system suddenly doubled, flooded my flower beds. The board sent a crew out, claimed it was routine maintenance. I didn't buy it then, and I sure don't now. I asked if she'd allow Nathan and the city inspectors to check her lines. She didn't hesitate. Come tomorrow. They found it almost immediately, a fresh branch off the same hidden bypass that originated under my yard, feeding directly into her sprinkler zone. That single discovery cracked the dam. By the end of the weekend, 5 more households reported anomalies: tampered valve boxes, unexplained pressure surges, patches of inexplicably lush grass in common areas that should have been bone dry. Each inspection revealed another clandestine connection. They weren't just taking from me. They were quietly redistributing my water across the association's entire Greenbelt network, likely to offset their own ballooning municipal bills while fining the rest of us for brown lawns. Stephanie Linwood moved like lightning. She amended the emergency filing to request class action certification. If enough neighbors joined, the suit would grow teeth sharp enough to bite through the board's defenses. Suddenly, my private battle had become a neighborhood reckoning. The next association meeting was standing room only. More than 40 residents crammed into the clubhouse, double the usual turnout. Folding chairs scraped across the floor. The air smelled of coffee and barely contained anger. Deborah Keller took the podium in a pale blue suit posture, rigid smile, practiced. She spoke of unfortunate misunderstandings and the importance of unity. She warned of potential environmental hazards from unregulated wells and the risk of divisive litigation bankrupting our reserves. Classic deflection. I stayed silent, in the back row, arms folded, letting the evidence speak through others. Rosa stood first. She held up printed photos of the pipe branching into her yard. "This isn't misunderstanding," she said, voice ringing clear. "This is theft." A murmur rippled outward. Then, the Parkers' young couple with toddlers described their flooded side yard and the sudden midnight sprinkler runs they hadn't programmed. One by one, voices rose. Questions turned to demands. Deborah's answers grew clipped, her smile brittle. And then her composure shattered. She jabbed a manicured finger in my direction. "This man is tearing apart the very fabric of our community. Spreading lies, frightening decent people." The room stilled. Tom Harding, once her reliable ally on the board, rose slowly. His face was ashen. "Deborah," he said, voice quiet, but carrying to every corner, "you never brought the siphon to a vote. You never told the full board. You spent association money on something none of us authorized. If anyone's destroying trust here, it's you." A beat of stunned silence. Then someone in the back began to clap. Another joined. Within seconds, the sound swelled, not for Deborah, but against her. She stood frozen at the front, alone beneath the fluorescent lights, as the illusion of absolute power slipped away like water through cracked fingers. The meeting ended in chaos motions, tabled voices, overlapping residents, clustering in angry knots. I slipped out early, the night air cool against my skin. When I reached home, I found my mailbox hanging crooked from its post-wood splintered screws, yanked out boot prints scuffed into the curb beside it. Vandalism. Clear, deliberate. I didn't rage. I documented photos from every angle, timestamps, close-ups of the damage. Then I drove to the police station and filed a report. Officer Ramirez listened carefully, jotting notes, promising follow-up. "This doesn't look like kids," he said. "Looks personal." He was right. The war had moved from letters and hidden pipes into the open, ugly, petty, and increasingly desperate. But every act of retaliation only tightened the noose around their own necks. And the deeper they dug, the closer they came to burying themselves. The vandalism didn't stop at the mailbox. Over the next few days, the petty assaults multiplied like weeds in untended soil. My HOA-issued gate clicker suddenly stopped working one morning. The alarm rose for every car but mine. Trash bins at the curb were accidentally skipped on collection day. An anonymous code enforcement complaint sent 3 county inspectors to my door, armed with tape measures and clipboards, claiming my wellhead violated setback distances, until I handed them the stamped survey plat and watched them leave red-faced. Each incident was small on its own, designed to irritate rather than destroy. But together they formed a pattern of harassment meant to wear me down, to make me doubt, to make me fold. They underestimated how much fight a father has when his children's peace is on the line. One evening, as rain finally broke the long drought and drummed steadily on the roof, an unmarked envelope slid under my front door. I found it after tucking Emma and Alex in their hair, still damp from baths drawn with water, that was finally, undeniably, mine. Inside was a single sheet of paper block letters typed in bold Times New Roman. "You think you're clever, but you've made enemies. We'll drain you before you win." No signature, no subtlety, just a threat, cold and anonymous. I didn't crumple it. I photographed it under bright kitchen light, slipped it into a plastic sleeve, and drove straight to the police station. Officer Ramirez added it to the growing file vandalism report, harassment pattern, now a written intimidation attempt. "These people are digging their own grave," he muttered, shaking his head. "Keep everything. We're building something solid here." Stephanie Linwood echoed the sentiment the next morning over coffee at her downtown office. "They're panicking," she said, eyes sharp behind stylish frames. "Threats mean they know the evidence is airtight. It also means we add intentional infliction of emotional distress and punitive exposure to the complaint." She paused, studying my face. "How are the kids holding up?" "Better than me some days," I admitted. Emma drew a picture of the well with flowers around it. Alex asked if the angry lady was going to take our sprinklers away. I told them Daddy's fixing it. Stephanie nodded. "Then let's fix it hard." That same week, a crack appeared in the board's armor from an unexpected direction. Alan Whitmer, former association treasurer who had resigned months earlier citing personal reasons, called Stephanie out of the blue. He wanted to meet. Off the record. We gathered in a quiet corner booth at a diner 20 minutes outside Hollow Creek. Alan looked thinner than I remembered, tie-loosened fingers drumming nervously on a manila folder. "I can't stay silent anymore," he began without preamble. Deborah created a discretionary fund labeled Landscape Emergency Allocation. $4,200 dispersed off books to a contractor for urgent irrigation modifications. That contractor installed your siphon. He slid the folder across the table. Inside copied emails, a screenshot of the bank transfer stamped CSA Well MOD, and a scanned receipt with a handwritten note in the margin, "DK approved." "CSA," Stephanie asked. "Her private code," Alan said bitterly. "Community supply adjustment." She used it to hide anything she didn't want the full board to see. It was the first direct proof of deliberate, unauthorized spending. Gold in a civil suit. Stephanie's team subpoenaed the full financial records within hours. The court granted it without hesitation. The board's response was immediate and frantic, a neighborhood-wide email blast, accusing me of sowing needless division, warning of grave risks to groundwater sustainability, and attaching a dramatically zoomed photo of my innocent well cap to make it appear menacing. It backfired spectacularly. Within hours, my inbox and Rosa's and the Parkers filled with messages from residents who had finally had enough. Why are they spending our dues fighting one homeowner? Is this why assessments went up 20% last year? How much is this lawsuit going to cost us? 2 more families joined the suit that week. Stephanie refiled, expanding it into a formal community impact claim with multiple plaintiffs. Discovery would now reach deeper every email, every minute, every dollar. Then came the petty sabotage that finally crossed into contempt. Late one dusk, while walking Max around the block, I heard it before I saw it, a faint telltale hiss near the shed like air escaping a punctured tire. I followed the sound on instinct flashlight beam cutting through gathering shadows. There, half hidden beneath overhanging ivy along the back fence, was another patch of freshly turned soil. A narrow PVC line glinted faintly, clamped crudely to what could only be a reconnected bypass. They had done it again, after the injunction, after the proof, after everything. My blood ran hot, then ice cold with fury. I took dozens of photos, careful not to disturb a thing. Called Nathan immediately. He arrived with flow meters and detection gear under cover of darkness. "They're pulling water right now," he confirmed grimly. "Active draw. This is willful contempt of a court order." Stephanie filed the emergency motion before sunrise violation of injunction, continued trespass request for sanctions, and personal liability. The judge wasted no time. An emergency summons landed on Deborah Keller's doorstep 72 hours later, ordering her and the remaining board members to appear and explain why they should not be held in contempt. That same evening, a knock sounded at my door. Tom Harding stood on the porch looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. "John," he said quietly, "we didn't know about the second tap. I swear it." I let him inside. He explained in a broken voice Deborah had acted alone this time, or with only one loyalist. She'd hired her own brother-in-law, paid under the table, installed at night. Claimed it was a temporary backup line for the South Trail. No vote, no disclosure. "I should have questioned harder," he admitted. "I'm resigning tonight." He handed me a folded letter, then walked away into the rain without another word. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like watching a house burn from the inside, one spark I'd lit, now consuming everything in its path. But the blaze was far from over, and the real inferno still waited in the courtroom. The emergency contempt hearing arrived on a morning thick with summer storm clouds, the sky low and brooding as if the weather itself sensed the reckoning ahead. Deborah Keller entered the courthouse soaked from the downpour, her usual impeccable suit clinging uncomfortably, flanked by the remnants of her board, who looked like men marching to their own funeral. Stephanie Linwood strode beside me in a tailored navy blazer, our evidence binder heavy in her arms. Hundreds of pages of proof that felt like armor. Inside the courtroom, the air was cool and hushed. The judge wasted no words. He reviewed the new photographs of the second siphon, the flow logs showing active theft after the injunction, Nathan's sworn affidavit, and the timeline laid out in stark black and white. Deborah's explanations crumbled under questioning. First, she claimed ignorance. Then emergency landscaping needs. Finally, she blamed a vague consultant whose advice somehow justified reconnecting the illegal line at night. Was this consultant formally retained by the association? The judge asked, voice flat. "No, Your Honor." Was the reconnection approved by board vote? "No, Your Honor." Were you personally aware of this court's explicit injunction prohibiting any further interference with Mr. Monroe's private well? A long pause. Her hands trembled on the table. "Yes," she whispered. The gavel fell like thunder. Contempt of court. Violation of injunction. Immediate cessation of all unauthorized use. Full restitution for any water diverted. Personal financial exposure pending further review. And the final hammer, formal referral to the State Attorney General for potential criminal prosecution. Deborah didn't meet my eyes. She stared straight ahead, face pale, as the weight of consequence settled on her shoulders like wet concrete. Outside, rain lashed the courthouse steps. Reporters huddled under umbrellas, but I slipped away without comment, driving home through sheets of water that finally felt cleansing. That evening, 3 neighbors waited on my covered porch, Rosa Martinez, the Parkers, and an older veteran I recognized from morning walks, his silver hair plastered from the storm. "We're drafting a petition," Rosa said, rain dripping from her umbrella. "Emergency vote to remove the entire board. We need 60% of owners to force it. And we want your guidance," Mr. Parker added. "You've seen through their tactics from the start." I looked past them to the street where water rushed along gutters, carrying away months of dust and dead leaves. Emma and Alex were inside building a blanket fort and giggling over flashlight shadows. "I'll advise," I said finally. "But I won't lead. I've got a family to protect and enough court dates ahead." The veteran nodded respectfully. "Fair enough. But fight with us all the same." We shook hands in the rain, a quiet pact sealed under the storm. Yet even as the board began to fracture, Deborah clung to power with the desperation of a drowning woman pulling others under with her. Stephanie filed the full civil suit the following week, not just for the siphons, but for trespass, utility, theft, vandalism, harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We named board members individually, piercing the association's corporate shield, so personal assets were at risk. "This isn't about the water anymore," Stephanie explained over the phone. "They turned governance into a weapon. Judges hate that." Our evidence stack grew thicker. High-resolution photos of both illegal taps, pressure logs proving ongoing draw, Deborah's courtroom admission, the threatening letter under my door, police reports on the mailbox and gate sabotage, Alan Whitmer's documents proving off-books payments. Then came the breakthrough that turned a strong case into an unbreakable one. Margaret Shen, a junior associate from the association's retained law firm, quietly resigned and reached out to Stephanie. We met her in a nondescript cafe far from Hollow Creek. She was nervous, voice barely above a whisper, but resolute. Before the first injunction, she said our senior partner sent the board a memo warning that any tap into your line would violate state utility code and expose them to civil and criminal liability. Deborah ignored it. "I have the routing records." She didn't possess the memo itself, but she pinpointed its location in the firm's digital archive, now subject to our subpoena. Within 48 hours of compelling production, we held the smoking gun, a formal legal opinion dated 6 days before the original siphon discovery, explicitly advising against the action. They had been warned in writing and proceeded anyway. Stephanie amended the complaint again: gross negligence, willful disregard of counsel, and bad faith conduct warranting punitive damages. The judge fast-tracked the case, scheduling depositions and placing Deborah under particular scrutiny for possible ethics complaints to the state bar. The board tried one last negotiation: remove the siphon, reimburse documented costs, issue a private apology, no admission of liability. Stephanie laughed when she read the offer. "They're dreaming." We rejected it outright. A second counter came: full board resignation, voided fines, modest settlement if I dropped personal liability. Again, no. This wasn't about settlement money. This was about accountability. And accountability was coming faster than any of us expected. Because the deeper we dug, the more rot we uncovered: not just one hidden pipe, but years of forged records, inflated contracts, and a culture of control that had poisoned the entire neighborhood. The real collapse was only beginning. Discovery hit the association like an earthquake, shaking loose secrets that had been buried for years. Stephanie's team poured over more than 1,200 pages of subpoenaed records, emails, meeting minutes, financial ledgers, vendor contracts, and draft amendments that had never seen daylight. What emerged wasn't just one act of theft. It was a pattern of quiet corruption woven into the very fabric of Hollow Creek's governance. There were unauthorized contracts with favored landscapers' invoices padded with thousands for work that was either substandard or never performed. One particularly egregious entry showed $8,000 spent on flower bed restoration along a strip of median that the city had already replanted at no cost to us. Dues money vanishing into vague categories like civic harmony initiatives and community enhancement reserves. But the deepest rot lay in the voting records. Several key amendments, ones that had expanded the board's emergency powers and relaxed financial oversight, were approved by unanimous consent in meetings where attendance logs claimed certain homeowners were present. Yet when Stephanie quietly contacted those residents, the truth unraveled. Some had been vacationing out of state. Others hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years. Rosa Martinez was listed as present and voting aye on a night she'd spent in the hospital with her late husband. Jeffrey Tao, who'd relocated to Arizona 18 months earlier, was supposedly in the room endorsing a special assessment that raised dues across the board. Forged signatures, fabricated attendance, fraud, plain and simple. We reached out to every affected homeowner. Most were stunned. Several agreed to provide affidavits. The lawsuit grew heavier with each new voice. In desperation, the board's attorneys filed motion after motion requests to seal records, claims of clerical error, arguments that past minutes weren't reflective of true board intent. The judge denied them all and appointed a special master, a neutral forensic accountant, to audit every transaction and verify every signature. That's when the second whistleblower stepped forward. Daniel Cho had been the association's IT consultant for nearly a decade, quiet, reliable, the man who kept servers humming and websites updated. He wasn't political. He simply believed in doing the job right. When subpoenas started flying and the news trucks appeared on our streets, his conscience finally outweighed his non-disclosure agreement. He arrived at Stephanie's office one rainy afternoon carrying a single thumb drive. "I made backups," he said simply. "Everything they thought they deleted." What Daniel provided wasn't just records, it was a window into the board's private deliberations, recovered emails, draft policies with tracked changes, and most explosive of all, an encrypted group chat between Deborah Keller and two of her most loyal board allies. Stephanie printed the transcripts and slid them across her desk to me that same evening. I read them under the warm pool of my desk lamp while Emma and Alex slept down the hall. Deborah: "If we let Monroe dig in and win, every homeowner will think they can ignore us. Permits or not, this is about control." Allie 1: "He's too organized. We should have buried him in fines earlier." Deborah: "The siphon was meant to force his hand. Now he's got half the street questioning us." Allie 2: "Spread something about contamination risks. Make people nervous." Deborah: "Yes, subtle. Mention it casually at the next meeting. Get Rosa on edge. She talks to everyone." My stomach turned. They hadn't just stolen water. They'd plotted to manipulate fear to isolate challengers, to poison the neighborhood's trust, one whispered rumor at a time. Stephanie wasted no time. She filed an emergency supplement to the complaint Civil Conspiracy to defraud homeowners and suppress dissent. She also petitioned the court to refer the entire matter to the district attorney for criminal review. The judge granted both. That same week, Hollow Creek made local headlines. Suburban HOA accused of water theft, forged records, and conspiracy. Screamed across Channel 7's evening broadcast. A reporter camped outside the clubhouse, microphone thrust toward any resident willing to talk. I stayed silent, letting the documents do the speaking. Then came the town hall, not organized by the board, but by us. Over 80 homeowners packed the community center on a humid Thursday night. Folding chairs groaned under the weight of bodies. Printouts of the chat logs, the forged minutes, and the news articles circulated like contraband. The air crackled with long-suppressed anger. Rosa took the makeshift stage, first voice, steady and strong. We trusted them to manage our neighborhood, not to rule it. One by one, residents stood. Stories poured out: unexplained dues, hikes, ignored maintenance requests, selective enforcement of rules that seemed to target anyone who asked questions. When Rosa gestured me forward, I hadn't planned to speak, but the room's eyes pulled me up. I stood beneath the harsh fluorescent lights and told them, not as an accuser, but as a father who had watched his children's simple joys almost stolen by pettiness. "I didn't drill that well to start a revolution," I said. "I did it so my daughter could run through a sprinkler and my son could fill a pool without feeling like criminals." What followed was never about water. It was about a handful of people who believed no one would ever hold them accountable. I paused, letting the words settle. But we are holding them accountable. Together. The applause started slow, then swelled until the walls seemed to vibrate. Tom Harding, recently resigned, stood near the back holding a clipboard. When the noise died down, he raised his voice. "This is a petition for an emergency vote to dissolve the current board and elect an interim council under independent oversight. We have 64 signatures already." The room erupted again, this time in cheers. 3 more board members resigned the next morning. The association's law firm formally withdrew representation, citing ethical conflicts. Deborah clung on alone, barricaded in her house, as the sheriff's civil process server delivered yet another notice, this one scheduling her deposition under oath. Word was she hadn't been seen in days. Her porch light stayed on all night. The HOA flag on her pole hung limp and faded. The empire she'd built on fear and fine print was collapsing brick by brick. And the sound of it falling was the sweetest silence I'd heard in months. The final hearing arrived on a crisp autumn morning, the air carrying the first real bite of cooler weather, a reminder that seasons change even when battles drag on. The courthouse parking lot was fuller than usual. Word had spread through legal newsletters and local media that Monroe versus Hollow Creek HOA had become a landmark case for homeowner rights. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt different, charged, yet strangely calm. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Stephanie, surrounded by neatly labeled binders and a quiet row of supporting residents, Rosa the Parkers, Jeffrey Tao, even Alan Whitmer and Daniel Cho, who had agreed to testify if needed. Across the aisle, Deborah Keller sat alone. No board members remained to flank her. No high-priced attorneys to whisper strategy. Her firm had withdrawn weeks earlier, citing insurmountable ethical conflicts. She represented herself now dressed in a plain gray sweater that seemed to swallow her frame. The once impeccable hair was pulled back severely, her hands folded tightly on the table, as if holding herself together by sheer will. Judge Ellison entered and called the session to order with a nod that conveyed quiet authority. He had reviewed the mountains of evidence overnight. Stephanie rose first, her voice clear and unflinching, as she summarized the claims: trespass, utility theft, vandalism, harassment, forgery, defamation, contempt, and civil conspiracy. Then came the exhibits projected large, on the courtroom screen for all to see. Slide after slide. Crystal clear photos of both illegal siphons, timestamps, glowing in the corner. Flow meter charts proving water diversion long after the injunction. Screenshots of the recovered group chat, Deborah's own words in cold black font. Forged attendance sheets side by side with affidavits from absent homeowners. The ignored legal memo from her own counsel warning of criminal exposure. Daniel Cho's recovered backups, including deleted emails plotting rumor campaigns. Each image landed with the weight of undeniable truth. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, but the judge silenced them with a glance. Deborah's turn came. She stood voice thin and spoke of good intentions and preserving community standards. She claimed the siphons were temporary measures during drought, that the chat logs were taken out of context, that forged records were mere administrative errors. The judge listened impassively, then asked the question that ended it. Ms. Keller, did you personally know that connecting to Mr. Monroe's private well, without consent, violated state law? She hesitated, eyes flickering to the exit, as if searching for escape. Yes, Your Honor. She finally admitted, the words barely audible. He leaned forward slightly. Then the court finds the defendant liable on all counts. A collective intake of breath filled the room. Even though the outcome had felt inevitable, hearing it spoken aloud carried a gravity that settled over us like falling leaves. The judge continued without pause. Given the breadth of misconduct and the defendant's fiduciary role, I award full compensatory damages to the plaintiffs, including legal fees, property repairs, and documented emotional harm. Punitive sanctions will be determined at sentencing. This matter is referred to the District Attorney for criminal review under relevant penal codes and to the State Housing Oversight Board for emergency audit and potential dissolution of the current Hollow Creek HOA charter. One final directive. The association shall issue a public retraction mailed to every resident and posted digitally acknowledging the wrongdoing, the false statements made about Mr. Monroe, and the board's systemic abuse of authority. Ms. Keller's signature required. The gavel fell. Final. Resonant. Deborah remained seated long after the courtroom emptied, staring at the table, as if it held answers she would never find. Outside, reporters clustered on the steps, cameras flashing against the gray sky. I offered no statement, just a brief nod to Stephanie, before walking to my truck. The drive home felt lighter, the road unspooling beneath tires that no longer carried the weight of constant vigilance. That evening, Emma greeted me at the door with a crayon masterpiece, our house green lawn blue well, and 4 stick figures, me, her, Alex, and Max, holding hands beneath a rainbow. At the top, in wobbly letters, "We won, Daddy." I hung it on the refrigerator, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, let the tears come not from anger or exhaustion, but from pure aching relief. The fallout unfolded swiftly. Within days, the court-supervised retraction letter arrived in every mailbox, sterile, formal, but public. Deborah's signature sat alone at the bottom, stark against white paper. By month's end, the remaining board members resigned en masse. Homeowners convened an emergency election under independent oversight. Rosa Martinez was chosen interim chair. Her first act was to freeze all spending and open the books completely. I declined any official role but agreed to consult on the new charter. Simple, transparent rules that put power back in residents' hands. Public budgets, recorded meetings, veto rights on major expenses, strict limits on fines. Dues dropped almost immediately. Tension evaporated like morning mist. Children played in sprinklers again without fear. Neighbors waved from porches without suspicion. Someone even repaired my mailbox quietly one night, new post solid and straight. Stephanie dropped by a week later with a framed copy of the final ruling. "This sets real precedent," she said, sipping coffee on my porch, while Alex and Emma chased Max across the grass. "Law schools will teach it. Other neighborhoods will cite it." I smiled, watching the late sun gild the lawn that had started it all. "I don't care about precedent," I replied. "I care that no one here will ever be bullied out of their own backyard again." And for the first time since drilling that well, the neighborhood felt less like a gated compound and more like a community, imperfect, but finally free. But the deepest changes were still coming, not in courtrooms or covenants, but in the quiet spaces where trust begins to regrow. The weeks after the ruling felt like the quiet exhale after a long-held breath. Hollow Creek Estates began to heal in ways both visible and subtle, like a garden slowly reclaiming itself after a brutal storm. Children's laughter echoed down the streets again, unfettered, unafraid. Sprinklers arced silver in the late afternoon sun, without anyone glancing nervously over their shoulders. Front porches filled with neighbors lingering over coffee or evening walks, conversations drifting from weather to weekend plans instead of whispered complaints about fines and favoritism. The new interim council, led by Rosa Martinez, moved quickly and transparently. Budget meetings were streamed live. Every expenditure over $500 required an open vote. Old violation notices were voided en masse. Dues were rolled back to pre-inflation levels, and the surplus from recovered, misspent funds went toward long-neglected repairs. Cracked sidewalks, flickering streetlights, the leaky clubhouse roof everyone had complained about for years. I kept my distance from leadership. When Rosa asked if I'd serve on the charter committee, I declined the chair but agreed to advise. My battles were mostly behind me. My priority now was the backyard, watching Alex practice soccer kicks against the fence and Emma plant wildflower seeds along the garden border, her small hands patting soil with fierce concentration. Yet people still came to me. First, it was the ones who had stood with me from the beginning. Then others, neighbors I'd barely nodded to in passing for years. The couple who once filed a complaint about my overgrown hedge during the drought. The elderly man who power walked every dawn without ever breaking stride to say hello. Even the teenager who used to roll his eyes when he biked past my drilling rig. They arrived at my door with pies apologies, or simply questions. Some wanted advice on permits. Others just needed to say, "We didn't see it then. We see it now. Thank you." I accepted every apology with a nod and a cup of coffee on the porch. I didn't need groveling. I needed the neighborhood to remember what it felt like to trust again. The most unexpected visitor came one Saturday afternoon, the air crisp with the scent of turning leaves. Rachel Langston, once Deborah's closest ally on the board, the woman who had co-signed the very first aesthetic violation against my well, stood on my doorstep, holding a homemade blueberry pie, steam still rising from the lattice crust. "I owe you this," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the welcome mat. I believed her. Every word. I voted for the fines, the amendment, even the siphon. I thought she was protecting something sacred. I invited her in. We sat at the kitchen table while Max thumped his tail hopefully beneath it. She told me things I hadn't known: how board meetings were rehearsed in advance, how questions were shut down with accusations of disloyalty, how vendors were chosen based on personal connections rather than bids. "I was afraid of losing my place here," she admitted, voice cracking, "of being the next one targeted. It's no excuse, but it's the truth." I didn't offer easy absolution. "Fear makes us complicit," I said. "The question is what we do once we see it." She nodded, tears brimming. "I'm testifying for the DA if they call me. And I've already given Rosa my resignation letter." We finished our coffee in silence, the pie untouched between us. When she left, she paused at the door. "I'm sorry, John, truly." I believed her. That same weekend, the new council hosted the first community barbecue. In years, no official HOA branding, no mandatory attendance, just an open invitation taped to the clubhouse door. The turnout was staggering. Grills smoked with burgers and ribs. Kids raced barefoot across grass that was finally allowed to grow naturally. Someone strung fairy lights along the fence line. A playlist of oldies drifted from portable speakers. Midway through the evening, Rosa clinked a plastic cup with a spoon to quiet the crowd. "We have someone to thank tonight," she announced, eyes finding me across the lawn. Not for winning a war because we all won this together, but for being the first to stand up and say, "Enough." Applause rose warm and genuine. I raised my soda in acknowledgement, heat rising in my cheeks. Later, as the sky deepened to indigo and fireflies began their dance, I slipped away to the edge of the gathering. Emma found me there, slipping her small hand into mine. "Are all the bad guys gone now?" she whispered. I squeezed her fingers. "The ones who mattered, yeah." She leaned against me, watching the lights twinkle. "The sky feels bigger again." Out of the mouths of children. A few days later, Rosa approached me with another idea, a simple guide for homeowners facing overreaching associations across the state. Practical steps, legal resources, warning signs. She wanted to call it the Monroe Report. I agreed on the condition that it tell the whole story. Not just the legal victories, but the fear, the isolation, the nights I lay awake wondering if I was tearing the neighborhood apart to save my own family. The way silence can rot a community from within, and how one reluctant voice can start to reverse it. We wrote it together over kitchen tables and coffee shop corners. It spread quietly at first through neighborhood forums, legal aid sites, even a viral Reddit thread. Emails trickled in from strangers in other states. "Thank you. We're fighting now too. Your story gave us courage." I never expected to become anyone's example. I'd only wanted water for my tomatoes and laughter in my backyard. But perhaps that's how real change begins, not with grand manifestos, but with a father refusing to let his children grow up afraid in their own home. As winter approached, the well remained a quiet fixture, capped securely metered, clearly humming softly beneath its stone casing. Emma's crayon drawing of our family and the rainbow hung laminated beside it, colors still bright. 3 neighboring families had since installed their own wells, legally independently with no drama. Emma proudly updated her hand-drawn voluntary water-sharing map on the fridge, adding new colored dots whenever someone joined the quiet network. It wasn't ideology. It was just neighbors choosing cooperation over coercion. And on quiet evenings, when the house was still and the kids asleep, I'd step onto the porch to listen crickets' distant dogs, the soft rush of wind through leaves that no one was measuring anymore. The neighborhood had found its peace again, not the enforced silence of compliance, but the deeper quiet of freedom reclaimed. One chapter closed, a better one slowly, carefully beginning. There is a kind of silence that arrives only after the storm has passed. Not the tense hush of fear, but a deeper, earned quiet that feels almost sacred. That's what settled over Hollow Creek Estates in the months following the ruling. No more anonymous letters in the mailbox. No more suspicious trucks idling at the curb. No more measuring tapes stretched across lawns to enforce invisible lines. The new council, small volunteer-run and fiercely transparent, operated more like a neighborhood cooperative than a governing body. Meetings focused on practical things, organizing block parties, scheduling bulk mulch deliveries, checking on elderly residents during heat waves. Fines became a relic of the past. The clubhouse bulletin board filled with sign-up sheets for potlucks and playground cleanups instead of violation notices. I still tended the well every Sunday morning, not out of necessity but ritual. I'd check the solar backup pump, clear the intake screen, run a quick purity test, just to hear the soft hum that had started everything. Emma's laminated crayon drawing hung nearby, colors vivid against the stone, our house, the blue well, the rainbow arching overhead. Sometimes Alex joined me, curious fingers tracing the pipes, as he asked questions only an 8-year-old can think of. "Is the water still ours forever, Dad?" "Forever," I'd answer, ruffling his hair. "And if anyone ever needs help getting their own, we'll show them how." Emma took her voluntary water-sharing map seriously. She'd added neat labels and colored stars for the 3 new wells that had appeared on our block and the 1-2 streets over. Families who once barely nodded now stopped by to compare notes on depth yields and filtration systems. It wasn't a rebellion anymore. It was just sensible living. One spring afternoon, Rosa invited me to speak at a city-sponsored forum on neighborhood governance. I almost declined, I'd had enough spotlights, but Stephanie convinced me otherwise. "Share the whole story," she said, "not the polished version, the real one." So I did. Standing before a packed community room, I spoke of the fear that had once lived in my house, the way I double-check locks at night, the knot in my stomach every time the mailbox creaked open. I told them about the nights I questioned myself, wondering if protecting my children's simple joys was worth fracturing the place we called home. But then I told them about the morning Emma asked if the sky felt bigger now, and how her small truth cut straight to the heart of it all. I ended with the line from Judge Ellison's ruling that I'd committed to memory. This case is not about water. It is about the misuse of authority, the power of persistence, and the right of every citizen to defend their home. The audience rose as one. Not for me, for the idea that ordinary people armed with nothing more than evidence and resolve can reclaim what was never theirs to surrender. Afterward, strangers approached with stories of their own battles against petty boards and overreaching rules. The Monroe Report had spread farther than we imagined, downloaded thousands of times, cited in lawsuits from California to Virginia. It wasn't fame I wanted. It was knowing that somewhere another parent might read it and decide not to stay silent. Deborah Keller's name surfaced one last time in a brief notice from the State Attorney General, a 10-year ban from serving in any fiduciary role for homeowners associations or nonprofits. Criminal charges for forgery and conspiracy remained under review. Rumor had it she'd moved across the country, tried to join another board, only to be turned away the moment her background check revealed our case. Consequence, not vengeance. On quiet evenings now, I sit on the porch with a cold drink, watching fireflies blink above grass that grows as tall as it pleases. Max sprawls at my feet. Emma and Alex chase each other until the stars come out, their laughter rising like music I once feared I'd never hear again. Sometimes a neighbor waves from across the street, or a kid on a bike shouts hello. The gates still close at dusk, but they no longer feel like bars. I keep the framed court ruling on my office wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. And beneath it, in Emma's careful 8-year-old printing, a new drawing, the same house, the same well, but now the rainbow stretches across the entire block, touching every roof. Because that's the real victory. It wasn't about the water. It was about remembering that beneath every imposed rule and silent compliance runs something deeper, something that belongs to each of us alone until we choose to share it. Dig deep enough, stand long enough, and you find it your own well. Clear, steady, unstealable. Once you drink from that place of courage and truth, you never run dry again.